In this video, we're going to build this 6S racer. This is the TransTEC Laser S. This isn't the easiest build, but it's also not too difficult. Let's have a quick look at all the parts. So first we've got the frame kit here. It's a really well-packaged frame, and it comes with a few TPU parts. We've got a camera mount and a couple antenna mounts. All the carbon comes vacuum sealed, and all of the nuts and bolts come in individual bags. Next, we've got the flight controller and 4-in-1 ESC. This is the Mamba F405. Next, we've got the iFlight Zing motors. These are the 2207 1800 kVs. And for the FPV camera, we've got the Caddx Rotel. This is the 1.66mm lens. And finally, we've got the HG-LRC Forward VTX, which supports up to 400 milliwatts. So let's start putting this thing together. Pay attention to these holes here. You want to make sure the indentation is pointed downward. And the arms will only go on their respective sides. So there's only one way to put this thing together, really. Just make sure that you get the arms in the right orientation. You want this curved end to point toward the middle of the quad. Make sure you refer to the instructions for the proper screw lengths. And once you've put it together, you can put these little rubber dampers in there. The best way to put them in is to squeeze them, put one end through, and twist. Now I like to sleeve my motor wires, and here I've got some Paramax. It's got a wider diameter than normal paracord, so all three motor wires will fit through. After you've sleeved all the motor wires, you can add a little bit of shrink tube, which will go over both ends. And now we can just mount the motors to the arms. And it's always a good idea to use blue Loctite, especially when you only have 3 screws holding your motors in. Now it's time to solder the motor wires to the 4-in-1 ESC. But first we need to separate the flight controller from the 4-in-1. And what I had to do here was replace the bottom standoffs, but leave these top standoffs here because you can't screw them in from the top. I put 8mm standoffs on the bottom. This is necessary because it's just not tall enough otherwise. And finally, I used 10mm screws to mount the stack to the frame. Now let's prepare all the pads for the motor wires. Add a little bit of flux to clean the pads, and just add a nice little ball of solder to each one. It's best to completely cover the pads so you don't see any more of the copper. I like to solder the motor wires from right to left, and it doesn't matter what order you put any of the 3 wires because you can always change the motor rotation in VLHeli Configurator on your computer later. Now it's time to melt the heat shrink, and the motors are done. Next we've got the receiver, and this is the FrSky XM Plus, which only requires 3 wires. I just borrowed some wires from the VTX. You don't need much wire, but you want to have enough to give you enough slack to pull the receiver out if you ever need to rebind to a different radio. Just make sure you've got all the wires in the right place, and you'll just be soldering them to the 3 respective pads over on the side of the flight controller here. Just take your time, and if you do accidentally bridge any pads, just use a little bit of flux and slice through there with your iron. Now we can solder up the power lead. The flight controller comes with a XT60, and what you want to do first here is fill the little wells with solder. Don't overfill them because they'll overflow when you push the wire in. Once you've got them filled up, you can heat it up and push the wire in there. Just be careful not to overflow and make a big mess. This can require a little bit of patience as well, so just take your time. Add a little bit of shrink tube, and you're done with this part of it. Now we need to solder the XT60 to the 4-in-1 ESC. Add a little bit of flux and cover the pads as we did with the motor wires. And this part can be a little bit challenging. You just need to have a good iron, and it can take a little while to get the heat to pass through the wires onto the pads. So what you might want to do is add a little bit of fresh solder to the motor wires as well as some flux so that the heat can transfer to the pads and it'll melt the solder. Now we can add the capacitor. This is the negative side and this is the positive side. Just solder directly on top of the battery leads here. And make sure you give yourself a little bit of slack because the TPU antenna mount needs to have a little bit of space. If the capacitor's too tight in there, you won't be able to fit that later. Now it's time to bind the receiver. I like to get this out of the way so I can tuck it away and not need to worry about it later. So what we need to do is hold the bind button, and what I like to use is a pair of tweezers and an alligator clip. That way I can use both hands to plug the battery in. Alright, and if you've got a smoke stopper, now is the time to use it. Plug your quad in and get that receiver into bind mode. Put your radio into bind mode and get yourself bound. You can always double check by plugging in and seeing the green light. Now we can add some shrink tube to the receiver and tuck it away between the flight controller and the 4-in-1 ESC. Now I don't like to fully melt the shrink tube because it can be hard to remove later in case you ever need to rebind or take it out of the rig. So I think just halfway is good enough. And once that's in place, you can feed the antennas through under the motor wires. And usually what I'll do is attach a couple zip ties to the arms and shrink tube the receiver antennas to the zip ties. Now we can mount the camera. Just add the camera to the TPU mount with the included screws. And I just put it in here first to see how it would fit. And it turns out that the camera connector is really close to the flight controller. So the best way to solder the wires is to kind of curl them around so you've got enough slack to adjust your camera angle. After cutting the wires down to size, we just need to solder the 5V, the ground, and the video input. And finally, we just need to plug the camera in and mount it to the frame. And now we can wire the VTX. And since this flight controller only offers 5V output, we need to power the VTX with the battery directly. And these two pads in the back here give you power directly from the battery. We also need the video out and the TX pads right here beside the USB. And since we're not powering the camera with the VTX, you'll want to remove the 5V out and the extra ground wire from the VTX wire harness. So you only need the 4 wires. Now you can mount the VTX, and you can use the standoffs that you pulled from the bottom of the stack. Just plug it in and make sure it is secured with the nylon nuts. Now for the antenna, it was a bit of a tight fit in the TPO connector here, but after pulling off the nuts and bits, I was able to squeeze it through with some pliers. Slide it under the battery lead and plug it into the VTX. And then we can add the little nuts and screw it into the top plate. Now we've just got a few minor details and this thing is done. So don't forget to secure the receiver wires to the zip ties. And you can screw the antenna on. I had to come back here because I forgot to insulate the capacitor wires. It's not good to leave them bare, especially when they carry the full voltage. So I add a little bit of hot glue between them and covered them up with some shrink tube. That way we don't have any shorts. Now for the finishing touches, we've got the battery pad, which fits perfectly down here on the bottom. It's always a good idea to secure the motor wires with some zip ties, so they're protected from snags on tree branches or anything else like that. Finally, it's a good idea to secure the battery lead with a zip tie back here, because the battery might get ejected and you don't want it tugging at your stack. So this is the complete build. The only thing left to do is to plug it into Betaflight and configure it. There's a written build guide for this on rotorbuilds.com, which is linked down in the description, and that will give you more detailed instructions as well as all the steps you need to take in Betaflight to get this configured. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments or on rotorbuilds.com. Also, please subscribe to my channel for more FPV related content.